Who was crazy until they were right all along? Hemingway. Before he took his life, he became extremely paranoid the FBI was following him. His wife and people around him just thought he was mentally ill and grew deeply concerned. Hemingway went as far as getting electrotherapy at a psychiatric hospital to try and help with the perceived delusions. Turns out the FBI had been following and bugging him for years according to declassified files. In comparison, there was a sci-fi writer Philip K. Dick who was convinced the FBI was monitoring him, so he kept sending demand letters that they release his file. His daughter was interviewed years after he passed. "I heard you've actually seen your father's FBI file and it is quite large." "Yes, it's rather large, but the only thing in there are copies of his demand letters." Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis, the dude who suggested that it might be a good idea to wash your hands before performing surgery. Semmelweis supposedly suffered a nervous breakdown and was committed to an asylum by his colleagues. He died 14 days later after being beaten by the guards, from a gangrenous wound on his right hand which might have been caused by the beating. Semmelweis's practice earned widespread acceptance only years after his death, when Louis Pasteur confirmed the germ theory. In the days of landlines, my phone was tapped. I could hear a strange hollow sound and I knew someone was listening. I had had a bad accident and was home for almost a year and involved in a lawsuit. I told my attorney about it. He told me the insurance company wouldn't bother. I mentioned it to my roommate. She told me I was crazy. I began to notice a van parked on my street. It was there for several days. I thought I was under surveillance. My attorney and my roommate said I was crazy. A person came to my door asking questions about the neighborhood. They claimed to be from a real estate company. They didn't go to other houses. I thought I was being watched. My attorney and my roommate said I was crazy. Several weeks later, my roommate's boyfriend was arrested for stealing physical and intellectual property from IBM. It was the beginning of the tech era and he stole millions in hardware and software and ideas. We were being watched to see if we were involved. The phone was tapped. We were under surveillance. We were taped. I wasn't crazy after all. Ludwig Boltzmann. His equations and formulas explained the physical properties of matter, but as it went against the then accepted laws of physics, he was ridiculed and ignored for years while fighting for atom theory to be accepted. He took his own life just 3 years before Ernest Rutherford discovered the nucleus of an atom, proving Boltzmann's theory. For a very long time, the medical community thought that stomach ulcers were caused by stress. A doctor in Australia called Barry Marshall claimed they were wrong and that they were caused by an excess of certain bacteria, and the cure was simple antibiotics. The medical community ridiculed him and nearly ended his career. He eventually decided the only way to prove he was right was to infect himself, develop the ulcers, and cure himself. In curing himself, he was proved right and won the Nobel Prize for his efforts. And now stomach ulcers are very easily treatable. They previously affected 1 in 10 people. What's sad about these stories is that somebody coming up with a theory like that seems to be exactly the sort of thing which should excite medical professionals, as it not only challenges their views but also proposes a more effective solution. It's easy for me to be wise in hindsight, but it isn't as if he was advising people to rub a rabbit's ears and the good vibes would make the ulcers go away. The "dingo ate my baby" lady got made fun of constantly, most notably in Seinfeld, and I believe went to jail because nobody believed her. Turns out a dingo ate her baby. This one was beyond fucked up. Your child is taken from you and killed by wild animals, then you're jailed for murdering your own child and ridiculed the world over for your lame story as to what actually happened. Then, being right the whole time. Not even being right, telling the truth the whole time. The ex-husband of my ex-girlfriend. Turns out he wasn't the crazy one after all. He kept trying to tell me, and if I would have listened from the beginning, I could have saved 4 years of my life. I'm so sorry, man. There are always 2 sides of every story, and unfortunately, sometimes we meet the liars first. Sinead O'Connor. She was a singer-songwriter from Ireland who was a staple in the alternative music scene during the late 80s and early to mid-90s, who had some crossover hits. Anyway, at the height of her popularity, she was the musical guest on Saturday Night Live after canceling an earlier scheduled spot in protest against the guest host, which was some dumbass stand-up comic from the 80s called Andrew Dice Clay, as Scott Thompson described him. It's as if someone took your grandmother, the one who can't speak English, and taught her to swear phonetically, gave her a special on HBO and made her a star. During her performance she sang an a cappella version of Bob Marley's War, changing the lyrics to make it about child sexual abuse instead of racism. At the end of the performance, she shouted something like, "Fight the real enemy," and ripped up a picture of the Pope. In the following weeks people lost their shit, and on the next episode of Saturday Night Live they had at least 3 sketches that tore her apart. A few years later the Catholic sex abuse scandal broke internationally. Courtney Love was warning everyone about Harvey Weinstein back in the mid-90s, but everyone just wrote her off. If you're a woman in this industry and Weinstein invites you to one of his parties, don't go. J. Harlan Bretz. He was a geologist that in the 1920s came up with a theory about why the dry falls and surrounding scablands of eastern Washington state were so sharp and abrupt, instead of smooth as should be with the general understanding of erosion, especially since the falls have no real river to speak of to create erosion. His theory was that a giant flood, created by an even more massive lake, ripped through the region millions of years ago, reshaping the landscape in a matter of days. He was laughed at and discredited in the geology community for almost 50 years, until someone discovered evidence in the 1950s of an ancient and massive lake that started just north of Montana that stretched all the way to southern Utah. The lake was believed to have been created by glacial dams, ice walls, during the last ice age. It would fill up over thousands of years and then hit a point where a glacial dam broke and the lake water would fire out the break like a water cannon, drain the lake, and reshape an entire region over several days as the water flowed toward the ocean. This happened several times. Since the flood that carved the dry falls likely started from the Lake Missoula area in modern-day Montana, it was named the Great Missoula Flood. Bretz was given an award in 1979 for his contribution to geology when he was 96 years old. He joked, "All my enemies are dead, so I have no one to gloat over." Harry Markopolos spent 10 years trying to convince everyone, investors, journalists, regulatory agencies, etc., that Bernie Madoff was a fraud, based on forensic accounting. Madoff was one of the most respected names on Wall Street, and despite the overwhelming evidence, no one was willing to entertain the thought he might be running a Ponzi scheme. Harry's book, No One Would Listen, is a pretty great account of financial detective work and just the abject frustration of being absolutely certain you're right but no one believes you. Michael Burry, the first guy to predict the 2008 housing market crash. He was a hedge fund manager for Scion Capital at the time and basically bet his entire fund's liquidity, all the money the fund had, that there would be a crash. No one believed him except a few other people who also bet against the market. Several of his clients sued him for tying their money up in what they considered to be a foolish bet, all to have him be right in the end. He made his fund something like $1.3 billion and the value increased about 489%. The movie The Big Short is about him and the few other people who were wise enough to bet against the market at the time. I've watched the movie like 5 times in order to try to understand exactly what happened but still don't fully get it. I recommend it to anyone who's interested. Fun fact, Michael Burry was also ahead of the curve in the recent GameStop surge. I think he had something like 1.2 million shares of GameStop months before the price shot up. Might need to fact check myself. Corey Feldman. Dude went on national TV to tell everyone that there was a network of sexual abusers in Hollywood, and that he himself had been abused, and people laughed at him and shunned him. And then it came out that pretty much everything he was saying was true. That one journalist, Gary Webb, that uncovered the truth that the CIA aided and abetted Nicaraguan Contra rebels in funneling cocaine into inner-city communities. The doctor who found COVID in China and was silenced and died in prison from COVID. Who was crazy until they were right all along? Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one.